The room was small, tucked away at the end of a long, narrow hallway that smelled of floor wax and old paper. It was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it is pressing against your eardrums. Sunlight tried to push through the single dirty window, cutting a bright white beam across the dusty floor, but the rest of the space was in shadow. In the center of this dim light stood a grand piano. It was an old instrument, the black finish chipped in places to reveal the wood underneath, and it looked like it had been played by 1,000 hands before today. Julian sat on the bench. It was a hard wooden bench, not particularly comfortable, but he didn't notice the discomfort. His entire focus was on the man sitting behind him. The man was Elias Thorne. To the rest of the world, Elias Thorne was a living legend. His name appeared in history books next to the great composers. He had played in sold-out concert halls in London, New York, and Vienna. He was known as a genius, a man who could pull music out of the air that made people cry without knowing why. But here, in this small rehearsal room, he was just a man in a gray sweater, sitting on a simple chair with his legs crossed. He held a small notebook in one hand and a pen in the other, but he wasn't writing. He was watching. He was watching Julian. It had been 10 minutes since Julian walked in, and Elias Thorne had not said a single word. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't greeted him. He had just pointed to the piano bench and sat back. That was all. Now, the silence was stretching out so long, it started to feel painful. Julian felt a drop of sweat slide down the side of his face, catching in his ear. He wanted to wipe it away, but he was scared to move. He felt like a rabbit under the gaze of a hawk. If he moved, maybe the hawk would swoop. Julian looked down at his hands. They were resting on his knees, shaking slightly. He tried to take a deep breath to calm down, but his chest felt tight. He had practiced for this. He had spent months preparing the specific piece Elias Thorne had requested. He knew every note, every sharp, every flat. He could play it in his sleep. But right now, looking at the black and white keys in front of him, his mind was going blank. The notes seemed to be swimming in front of his eyes. Why wouldn't the man say something? The sound of a car horn honking far away on the street made Julian jump. He felt foolish. He was supposed to be a professional, or at least he wanted to be. He had dreamed of this moment since he was a little boy, hearing his first record of Elias Thorne playing. He remembered thinking, I want to make sounds like that. He had spent thousands of hours in rooms smaller than this one, practicing until his fingers bled, sacrificing parties and holidays and sleep just to get a little bit better. And now, here he was, sitting 5 feet away from his hero, and he felt paralyzed. Behind him, he heard the squeak of a chair leg shifting against the floorboards. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't turn around. He stared straight ahead at the music stand on the piano. It was empty. Thorne hadn't even asked him to bring sheet music. He just wanted him to play. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't just a casual glance. Elias Thorne was staring at the back of Julian's neck with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Julian could almost feel the man's eyes burning into his skin. He imagined what Thorne might be thinking. Is he judging my posture? Is he looking at my cheap clothes? Is he wondering why I'm even here? The man was famous for being difficult. Rumors around the music schools said that Thorne could tell if a musician had heart within 5 seconds of seeing them. He didn't just hear the music. He saw the person. He looked for the truth. Julian felt a lump forming in his throat. He felt like a fraud. He looked at his reflection in the polished wood of the piano lid. He looked young, scared, and out of place. Who was he to think he could play for a man like this? Suddenly, the silence broke, but not by a voice. It was the sound of a sigh. A long, slow exhale of breath came from the chair behind him. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a storm. It sounded like disappointment. Julian's stomach dropped. He is bored, Julian thought. He is already bored, and I haven't even played a note yet. The urge to run was strong. Julian thought about standing up, muttering an apology, and walking out of the room. He could go back to his normal life. He could go back to giving lessons to beginners who didn't care if he was perfect. It would be safe. It would be easy. But then he remembered why he came here. He remembered the feeling of music flowing through him, the moments when everything else in the world disappeared and there was only the sound. He wanted Elias Thorne to hear that. He needed him to hear it. He moved his hands from his knees and placed them gently on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under his fingertips. It was a familiar feeling, a comforting feeling. His right hand found a C, and his left hand found a low F. Just touching the keys made his breathing slow down a little bit. This was his language. This was where he lived, but he still couldn't start. He could feel Thorne's eyes on him like a spotlight. The pressure was incredible. It felt like the air in the room had turned into water, thick and hard to move through. Julian closed his eyes for a second, trying to picture the music in his head. He tried to see the notes floating in the dark, but all he could see was the stern face of the old man sitting behind him. "You are thinking too much," a voice said. Julian's eyes snapped open. He spun around on the bench. Elias Thorne hadn't moved. He was still sitting with his legs crossed, the notebook resting on his knee. His face was serious, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Julian stammered. His voice cracked, sounding weak in the large room. Thorne didn't respond to the apology. He just tilted his head slightly to the side. He looked at Julian, really looked at him, as if he were looking for something hidden deep inside his chest. "The piano is not a test," Thorne said. His voice was gravelly and low, like dry leaves scraping together. "It is not a math problem to be solved. You are sitting there trying to calculate the answer. That is not music." Julian felt his face get hot. He turned back to the keys, feeling even more embarrassed. He had been calculating. He was worrying about the tempo, the dynamics, the technique. He was trying to be perfect. "Stop trying to be perfect," Thorne said, as if reading his mind. "I have heard perfect. It is boring. I hear perfect all day long from robots in conservatories. I want to hear something else." The room went silent again. Julian stared at the keys. He felt a spark of anger, mixed in with the fear. Who was this man to tell him he was boring? Julian had poured his life into this. But underneath the anger, he knew Thorne was right. He was playing safe. He was playing by the rules. He was terrified of making a mistake. So he was choking the life out of the music before it even started. Julian took another breath. This one was deeper. He let his shoulders drop, realizing they were hunched up near his ears. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They looked strong. He decided to forget about the rules. He decided to forget about the audition. For a moment, he tried to pretend he was back in his own apartment. Late at night, playing just for himself, with no one watching. He remembered the loneliness of those nights, but also the freedom. He pressed down on the keys. The first chord rang out, loud and clear, cutting through the thick air of the room. It wasn't a polite sound. It was a harsh, almost aggressive sound. It startled a pigeon outside the window, which flew away with a flurry of wings against the glass. Julian didn't stop. He didn't wait for permission. He let his fingers move. He played the opening phrase of the piece, but he played it slower than he had practiced. He dragged the tempo, letting the notes hang in the air until they vibrated against the walls. He wasn't thinking about the fingering. He was just following the sound, chasing the feeling of the melody. He could hear the shift in the room instantly. The air didn't feel so heavy anymore. The dust motes dancing in the beam of light seemed to move in time with the music. The silence that had been oppressing him was gone, replaced by the noise of the instrument. Behind him, he heard the chair creak again. He didn't turn around this time. He kept playing. He poured his nervousness into the music, turning the fear into sharp staccato notes. He poured his frustration into the loud bass chords. He let the anger at the man's judgment spill out onto the keys, making the piano roar. It felt dangerous. It felt like walking on a tightrope without a net. He was taking risks he had never taken in practice. He was skipping notes he usually hit perfectly, adding accents where there weren't any written on the page. He was ruining the structure of the piece, or at least, that is what his teachers would have told him. But for the first time since he sat down, Julian felt like he was actually there. He wasn't just a musician playing a song. He was a person telling a story. He was fighting for his place in that room. He was fighting for the respect of the man sitting in the shadows. The music swelled, filling every corner of the small rehearsal hall. It bounced off the cracked plaster and the single window pane. It was messy and raw, and it was beautiful. Julian's eyes were closed now, his head swaying slightly with the rhythm. He had forgotten the sweat on his face. He had forgotten the notebook in Thorne's hand. There was only the vibration of the strings under his fingers and the sound pouring out of the wood. The sound of the last heavy chord still hung in the air, vibrating against the walls, but Julian did not let himself stop. He knew that stopping now would be the end. If the silence came back, his courage would leave with it. So, he took a deep breath and pushed his fingers into the next measure. The music shifted from the angry, loud opening into a fast, complicated section that required his hands to move like spiders across the keys at first. His fingers remembered what they had practiced for months. They found the right notes. The rhythm was steady, like a clock ticking. Up and down the keyboard his hands went, dancing over the white and black keys. He was playing perfectly. Every note was clear. Every scale was even. Any teacher in a music school would have nodded their head and said, "That is correct." But it didn't feel right. Julian could feel a distance growing between him and the piano. He was watching his own hands, as if they belonged to a stranger. He was so focused on not making a mistake that he had stopped listening to the music. He was just trying to survive. He was trying to get to the end of the page without falling off the cliff. And while he was busy trying to survive, he could feel the eyes of Elias Thorne burning into his back. The old man had not moved. He had not applauded. He had not shouted stop. He just sat there. And that silence was louder than any shout. It felt like a heavy weight tied around Julian's neck, pulling him down. Julian's eyes flicked to the side, trying to catch a glimpse of Thorne's reflection in the dark window. The glass was old and dusty, but he could see the shape of the man sitting in the chair. Thorne was leaning forward again. His elbows were on his knees, his chin resting on his clasped hands. He was staring intently at Julian's hands. He is looking for the crack, Julian thought. He is waiting for me to break. The thought made Julian's throat go dry. He swallowed hard, but his mouth felt like it was full of sand. He tried to push the thought away, but it stuck there, crawling around in his mind. He realized that Thorne wasn't just listening to the notes. He was watching the mechanics. He was looking at Julian's posture, checking to see if his shoulders were tense, watching to see if his wrists were stiff enough. He was analyzing Julian like a mechanic looking at a car engine, checking for loose parts. The pressure began to change the way Julian played. His fingers, which had been loose and flowing, started to tighten up. The muscles in his forearms became hard as rocks. He began to hit the keys too hard. The beautiful singing tone he had started with turned sharp and banging. The piano sounded like it was being attacked instead of being played. "Play softer," he told himself. "You are hurting the music." But he couldn't stop. He was trapped in the rhythm. The faster he played, the faster his heart beat. It felt like a panic attack rising in his chest. He could hear a slight buzzing in his ears. The room felt incredibly hot, even though the window was open. A drop of sweat rolled off his forehead and landed right on the B key. His finger slipped on the wet spot. It was a small mistake. Just a tiny slip where his finger hit B instead of C. Lasted only a fraction of a second. To a normal person, it might have sounded like a blur. But to Julian, it sounded like a gunshot. It was a jagged tear in the fabric of the song. He flinched. His hands stumbled for just a moment. The rhythm wobbled. He recovered quickly, getting back on track, but the damage was done. The spell was broken. The confidence he had built in the first few minutes evaporated like water on a hot stove. He was no longer telling a story. He was just a scared kid trying to fix a broken window while someone watched behind him. He heard the squeak of the chair again. Julian squeezed his eyes shut for a second. "Don't think about him," he screamed in his head. "Just play. Get to the end." But the harder he tried to ignore the famous musician, the more aware he became. He imagined what Thorne was writing in that little notebook. Technically okay, but no soul. Too nervous. Waste of time. The criticism in his head was crueler than anything the man could actually say. He played on, entering the middle section of the piece. This part was supposed to be light and playful, like a butterfly flying in the garden. But Julian was too heavy. His fingers were like lead weights. He mashed the keys, trying to force the sound out. The piano groaned under the pressure. He was fighting the instrument, wrestling it into submission. Instead of working with it, he risked another look at Thorn. The older man had not moved his gaze. He was still staring at Julian's hands with a laser focus. But now, his head was tilted slightly to the left, and his eyebrows were drawn together in a frown. It wasn't an angry frown, but a curious one. It's like a doctor looking at an X-ray that doesn't make sense. That frown terrified Julian more than anything. If Thorn was angry, it meant Julian had messed up. If he was confused, it meant Julian was doing something wrong that he didn't even understand. Julian's breath started coming in short. Ragged gasps. He felt like he was running a race while carrying a refrigerator. His hands were sweating so much that his fingertips were sliding off the keys. He had to grip them harder to keep from slipping, which made his playing sound stiff and robotic. The music had lost all its shape. It was just noise, a loud, fast, nervous noise. The room felt smaller. The walls felt like they were closing in. The dust dancing in the beam of light seemed to be mocking him. Even the pigeon outside the window cooed, as if laughing at his struggle. He was approaching the hardest part of the song. It was a section of huge jumping chords. The left hand had to jump all the way down to the low bass notes, while the right hand played a complex melody in the middle. It was a section he had practiced thousands of times. He could usually do it in his sleep, but today, with his hands wet and his shaking and the old man watching, his brain refused to cooperate. His eyes locked onto the keys, darting back and forth like a trapped animal. Left hand, go low. Right hand, stay middle. Now. He made the jump. His left hand hit the bass notes hard, but his right hand was a split second too slow. The collision was chaotic. The notes clashed. A horrible, discordant sound crashed through the room. It sounded like someone dropped a tray of metal glasses on a stone floor. Julian stopped. His hands froze in midair. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the worst silence he had ever heard. The horrible vibration of the mistake seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, slowly fading away, leaving nothing but shame behind. Julian sat there, his chest heaving. He waited for the voice. He waited for Elias Thorne to say, "That is enough." He waited for the sound of the chair scraping the floor as Thorne stood up and walked out. He knew he had failed. He had played like a robot, then he had played like a nervous wreck, and finally, he had crashed. The audition was over. He had blown his chance. Stand up, he told himself. Say you are sorry and leave. But his legs wouldn't move. He was glued to the bench. He stared at the keys, his vision blurring with tears of frustration. He was so angry at himself. He had the talent. He knew he did. Why couldn't he show it? Why did the fear have to win? Behind him, there was still no sound. No movement. No footsteps walking away. Julian turned his head slowly, terrified of what he would see. He expected to see Elias Thorne looking at his watch, bored and disappointed. He expected to see the notebook closed, the man ready to leave. But Thorne was still sitting there, and he wasn't looking at his watch. He was looking straight at Julian. Thorne's face was no longer frowning. It was completely still, like a stone statue. But his eyes, those dark, sharp eyes, were boring into Julian's with an intensity that made him shiver. Thorne didn't look disappointed. He looked intent. He looked like a wolf watching a deer that was limping. The old man slowly raised one hand and gestured toward the piano keyboard. He didn't say a word. He just pointed his finger. It was a command. Keep going. Julian blinked. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. The man wanted him to continue? After that terrible crash? After that mess? Julian looked back at the keys. His hands were trembling violently. He felt like he had no strength left. But the look in Thorne's eyes told him that stopping was not an option. Stopping was quitting. And quitting was the only real failure. He took a shaky breath. He placed his hands back on the keys. They felt slippery and cold. He had to play the transition again. He had to fix the mess. He had to pick up the broken pieces of the song and try to glue them back together. While the music was still moving, he started the measure again. He played it slowly this time, terrified of missing. He concentrated so hard that his head hurt. He hit the jumps. Low bass, middle melody. He landed them. But the music felt dead. He was so careful, so terrified of making another mistake, that all the emotion was gone. He was tiptoeing through the rest of the song, apologizing for every note he played. He played through the rest of the page. He played the soft ending. He played the final, fading notes. And when he lifted his hands off the keys at the very end, he felt a profound sense of relief that it was over, mixed with a deep, dark sadness. He knew he hadn't played well. He had played safely. He had played like a coward. He had survived the notes, but he had killed the music. He had let the fear of the man in the chair turn him into a machine. Julian sat slumped over the keyboard, his head hanging low. He didn't want to turn around. The silence in the room was heavy, like a thick blanket that made it hard to breathe. Julian kept his head down, his chin almost touching his chest. He was staring at his knees, waiting for the sound of the door opening. He was waiting for the footsteps that would tell him his dream was over. He expected Elias Thorne to say something cold, something sharp that would cut him deep before he left, but the door did not open. The footsteps did not come. Instead, there was a soft sound from the chair behind him. It was the sound of the notebook closing. The snap of the cover shutting was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Julian flinched, but he didn't turn around. He felt a hot wave of shame wash over his face and neck. He knew what that sound meant. It meant the evaluation was finished. Thorne had seen enough. He had heard enough. He had made his decision. Julian felt a lump in his throat that hurt. He gripped the edge of the piano bench until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hit the keys one last time and break something. But most of all, he just wanted to run away and hide. He had played like a machine. He had played like a scared child. He had forgotten everything he ever knew about music because he was too busy worrying about what a man in a chair thought of him. Then, a strange thought popped into his head. It was a small, dangerous thought. He is still there. If Thorne had hated it completely, surely he would have left by now. A man like Elias Thorne didn't waste time. If Julian was truly hopeless, the old man would be walking down the hallway right now. But the air behind him was still. The presence was still there. Thorne was waiting. Julian took a shaky breath. He lifted his head slowly and looked at the dusty window. The sun was lower now, casting long golden shadows across the floor. He had one chance left. Maybe not to be perfect, maybe not to be a genius, but to be honest. He realized suddenly that he had been lying since he walked into the room. He had been trying to be the person he thought Thorne wanted. He had been trying to play perfectly. But there is no such thing as perfect. Perfect is dead. Perfect is a statue. Music is supposed to be alive. Julian's hands were still hovering over the keys. He felt the vibration of the strings fading away inside the piano. He made a decision. It wasn't a decision made with his brain. It was a decision made with his gut. It was a sudden, desperate leap into the unknown. He didn't start a new song. He went back to the middle of the piece he had just butchered. He went back to the part where he had stumbled, where he had panicked. He closed his eyes. He didn't care about the tempo. He didn't care about the speed. He didn't care if his wrists were at the right angle. He forgot about the scales and the arpeggios. He forgot about the music conservatory rules. He let out a long breath, releasing all the tension in his shoulders, and let his fingers fall onto the keys. The sound was different instantly. It wasn't a bang. It was a sigh. He played the chord slowly, dragging the rhythm out until it felt like the note was stretching thin. It's like a rubber band about to snap. It was too slow. Technically, it was wrong. Any music teacher would have marked it with a red pen, but it felt real. He moved to the next chord. Again, he took his time. He let the notes bleed into each other, creating a muddy, thick sound that was full of emotion. He wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. He was thinking about a rainy day he remembered from when he was a child. He was thinking about the sound of the rain on the roof and the feeling of being safe inside. He let that memory fill his hands. The music changed. It stopped being a performance. It stopped being an exam. It became a conversation. It became a cry. Behind him, the atmosphere shifted. He could feel it. The judgment that had been pressing down on his neck like a heavy hand lifted slightly. The air in the room felt lighter. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeam didn't look like mocking eyes anymore. They looked like gold dust floating in a dream. Julian began to play the melody, but he changed it. He added small pause, breaths where there weren't any written in the music. He hesitated on the high notes, like he was scared to reach them, and then he pushed through them, making them sing out in a voice that sounded vulnerable and broken. It wasn't beautiful in a polished way. It was beautiful in a human way. It had scars on it. It had cracks in it. He was taking a massive risk. He was gambling everything. He knew that Elias Thorne might hate this even more. The old man might think he was destroying the composer's work. But Julian didn't stop. He couldn't stop. A dam had broken inside him. And all the feelings he had been suppressing for years, his fear, his loneliness, his desperate need to be understood, came flooding out through his fingers. He played the difficult section again, the part where he had messed up before. But this time, he didn't try to jump his hands fast. He played it like a struggle. He made the music sound like a fight. The low notes were punches. The high notes were cries for help. He let his hands get heavy. He let the piano groan. He stopped being polite and started being raw. Sweat was dripping from his nose onto the keys, but he didn't wipe it away. His eyes were squeezed shut so tight that he saw colors exploding in the dark. He was swaying back and forth, his whole body moving with the music. He had forgotten about the chair. He had forgotten about the famous musician. He was alone in the universe with nothing but the sound. He slowed the tempo down even more. It was dangerously slow now. If he lost focus for even a second, the whole rhythm would collapse and the song would die. But he held it. He held the tension in the air like a man holding a tiger by the tail. The silence between the notes became as important as the notes themselves. He was using the silence to speak. He poured his anger into the bass, thumping the keys with the heel of his hand. He poured his sadness into the treble, letting the notes weep. He was telling the truth. For the first time in his life, he was telling the absolute truth with his instrument. He wasn't showing off his skills. He was cutting open his chest and showing his heart. And then, felt something. He couldn't hear it, but he could feel it in the room. The energy behind him had changed completely. The coldness was gone. The distance was gone. The man in the chair was no longer a judge sitting on a high pedestal. He was right there with him. Elias Thorne was leaning forward, pulled in by the gravity of the music. Julian dared to open his eyes for a split second. Just to glance at the reflection in the window, he couldn't believe what he saw. Elias Thorne was on the edge of his chair. His notebook was on the floor, forgotten. The pen was lying on the tiles. Thorne wasn't frowning. He wasn't looking at his watch. He was staring at Julian with his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide and alive. The famous mask of the grumpy genius was gone. In its place was the face of a man who was witnessing a miracle. Julian almost smiled, but he caught himself. He couldn't lose the focus. He had to keep going. He was approaching the end of the phrase, the climax of the risk. He had built a tower of tension with these slow, heavy notes, and now he had to finish it. He took a deep breath that filled his lungs completely. He didn't play the ending quietly. He didn't play it safely. He slammed his hands down on the keys, playing a massive chord that rang out like a church bell on a stormy night. He held the chord, letting his feet stomp on the sustain pedal, filling the room with noise until it felt like the walls were shaking. And then, in the middle of that loud noise, he lifted his hands. The silence that rushed back in wasn't empty. It was buzzing. It was electric. It was a silence that was full of everything he had just said. The air in the room felt like it had been cooked by the heat of the music. Julian sat there, his hands hovering in the air, his chest heaving like he had just run a marathon. He was exhausted. He felt empty, but in a good way. He felt like a glass of water that had been poured out completely. He didn't turn around. He was scared too. He had just broken every rule of the audition. He had played the wrong tempo. He had ignored the music. He had been messy. He had been loud. He had been rude to the instrument, but he hadn't lied. He sat and listened to his own heartbeat. It was thumping loudly in his ears. Thump, thump. He waited for the reaction. Would Thorn be angry that he had changed the piece? Would he be offended that Julian had ignored his earlier silent advice? The seconds ticked by. 1 second. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. The only sound was the fading vibration of the piano strings and the distant traffic outside. Julian stared at his hands. They were red and trembling. He realized that his fingers were hurting. He had pressed so hard his fingertips felt bruised. He knew he couldn't sit there forever. He had to turn around. He had to face the man. He slowly turned on the bench, the wood creaking under him. He looked at Elias Thorne. The old man hadn't moved. He was still leaning forward, his hands gripping his knees. He looked older than he had before, but he also looked younger. It was a strange contradiction. He looked like a man who had just remembered something he had lost a long time ago. His eyes were fixed on Julian, not with judgment, but with a look of wonder. The notebook was still on the floor. The pen was still rolling slowly across the tiles. The silence wasn't scary anymore. It was respectful. It was the kind of silence you give to a speaker who has just finished telling a great story. It was a holy silence. Julian looked into those dark eyes and saw something that made his breath catch. The silence that filled the room was not empty. It was heavy, thick with things that had not been said. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the air feels cleaned and fresh. But you are still afraid to move because you don't know if the wind has truly died down. Julian sat frozen on the bench, his hands resting on his knees. His chest was heaving, his lungs trying to catch up with the demand he had just put on them. He was staring at Elias Thorne, waiting, watched the old man's face like a hawk, looking for a clue, a sign, anything that would tell him if he had just ruined his life or saved it. For a long time, Thorne did nothing. He didn't blink. He didn't look away, just sat there, his hands clasped loosely together, his eyes fixed on Julian with an intensity that made Julian's skin prickle. The famous notebook was still lying on the floor where it had fallen. The pen had rolled away under a chair. It was as if the tools of judgment had been discarded, thrown away because they were no longer needed. Julian saw the muscles in Thorne's jaw work, like he was chewing on a tough piece of meat. Then very slowly, the older man leaned back. The movement was slow and heavy, like the machinery of an old clock ticking. Shifted his weight in the chair and the leather squeaked. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet room. Thorne let out a breath. It was a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a deflating tire. He rubbed a hand over his face, scrubbing his eyes and his forehead. When he took his hand away, his expression had changed. The harsh, cold mask of the critic was gone. In its place was something much softer, something that looked almost like exhaustion, but a good kind of exhaustion. It looked like the look of a man who has finally found water after walking in a desert for days. "You broke the rules," Thorne said. His voice was quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of fact. It sounded like gravel crunching under boots. Julian swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was full of sandpaper. I know," Julian whispered. He didn't know what else to say. He knew he had played the wrong tempo. He knew he had ignored the sheet music. "I'm sorry, I couldn't play it the other way anymore." Thorne stared at him. Why? The question hung in the air. Why? Why risk it? Why throw away months of practice for a feeling? Why gamble your future on a split-second decision? Julian looked down at the keys. They were blurred through his watery eyes. "Because the other way was safe," Julian said, finding his voice. "It was perfect, but it was dead. I felt like I was lying. Felt like I was reading a grocery list instead of a story. I didn't come here to be safe. Came here to be heard." He looked back up, terrified to meet Thorne's eyes, but forcing himself to do it. If you want a robot, you can buy a machine. I wanted to show you. Me. Thorn didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had played the world's greatest stages. They were old now, spotted with age, the skin thin and papery. But as Julian watched, Thorn flexed those fingers. He opened and closed his fist, as if he were trying to grab hold of a memory that was slipping away. You know how many people have sat on that bench? Thorn asked, waving a hand vaguely at the piano. Thousands. Dozens. Every year. They come in here with their perfect posture and their perfectly memorized notes. They play like they are afraid the music will bite them if they make a mistake. They play to please me. They play to please their teachers. They play to please the critics. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto Julian's. In all my years, I have heard very few people who play to please the music itself. Julian felt a shiver run down his spine. It started at the base of his neck and went all the way to his toes. The tension that had been knotting his stomach began to loosen just a little bit. When you started, Thorn continued, you were terrible. You were stiff. You were thinking too much. I was ready to ask you to leave after 2 minutes. I have heard that sound 1,000 times. It is the sound of fear. He paused. He looked at the floor, at the discarded notebook. But then, you changed. You stopped playing the piano and you started playing the piano. There is a difference. Most people hit the notes. You turned the notes into a voice. And it wasn't a polite voice. It was a shouting, angry, sad voice. It was a human voice. Thorn slowly pushed himself up out of the chair. He groaned a little as his knees cracked, standing up to his full height. He wasn't a giant of a man, but in that room, he seemed to cast a huge shadow. He walked toward the piano. Julian wanted to shrink away. He felt small under the gaze of the legend. But Thorn didn't stop at a distance. He walked right up to the piano, standing right next to Julian, so close that Julian could smell the old man's cologne, a mix of cedar wood and old paper. He could feel the heat radiating from Thorn's body. Thorn reached out. He placed his hand on the top of the piano right next to Julian's arm. He didn't touch Julian, but his presence was overwhelming. You took a risk, Thorn said, looking down at the keys. Risk is dangerous. It can get you killed in this business. But without risk, there is no art. You could have failed today. You could have made a fool of yourself. For a moment, you did fail. The technique was messy. It was rough. It was ugly in places. Thorn turned his head and looked Julian in the eye. The distance between them, the master and the student, the judge and the criminal, seemed to vanish. They were just two people standing in a room, connected by the sound that was still echoing in their minds. But it was true, Thorn said softly. And the truth is always more beautiful than a lie, even if the lie is polished and perfect. Julian felt the tears finally spill over. He didn't wipe them away. He let them run down his cheeks, hot and salty. He felt like he was floating. He felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders, a weight he had been carrying for years without even knowing it. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be real. Thorn looked at the piano keys with a strange expression in his eyes. It looked like longing. I used to play like that, he whispered, so quietly that Julian almost didn't hear him. A long time ago, before I became famous, before I knew the rules. I used to play with blood on my hands, he sighed, a deep, heavy sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. I forgot what that sounded like. Thank you for reminding me. Julian gasped. Thank you? The Elias Thorn was thanking him? It didn't seem possible. It felt like a dream. He wanted to pinch himself, but he was scared that if he moved, the magic would break. Thorn took his hand off the piano and straightened his sweater. He cleared his throat, and for a second, the cold mask of the famous musician tried to slip back into place, but it didn't fit anymore. The cracks in the armor showed through. The human underneath was visible. The technique needs work, Thorn said, his voice gruff again, but not unkind. Your tempo was reckless. Your timing was sloppy. If you play like that in an orchestra, the conductor will throw a stand at your head. Julian nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. I know, he said, and he actually smiled a little. It was a shaky, nervous smile, but it was real. I can fix the technique. I can practice the timing. But I can't practice the feeling. That has to just happen. Thorn nodded. Exactly. He looked around the dusty room at the sunbeam cutting through the dust. You came here thinking you had to prove you were the best. Thought you had to be better than everyone else? But you don't. You just have to be better than you were yesterday. You have to be willing to bleed a little bit. The old man took a step back. He looked at Julian, really looked at him, as if he were committing Julian's face to his memory. The scrutiny was back, but it was different now. It wasn't the critical stare of a judge looking for flaws. It was the interested gaze of a master who had found a rough diamond in a pile of glass. Thorn saw the potential. He saw the raw energy, saw the spark that could be fanned into a fire. Stand up, Thorn commanded. Julian didn't hesitate, stood up from the bench. His legs felt weak, like jelly, but they held him. He stood facing the old man. For the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt like he was looking Thorn in the eye as an equal, or at least as a fellow traveler. Thorn looked at the piano, then back at Julian. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't a heavy silence. It was a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a job well done. City sounds outside, cars honking, people talking seemed very far away. Here, in this dusty room, time seemed to have stopped. Played a story today, Thorn said, crossed his arms over his chest. It wasn't the story in the book. It was your story. And it was a story worth hearing. He paused. The air between them seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Julian waited for the dismissal. He waited for good job. Go home now. He waited for I will call you. But Thorn didn't say any of those things. He just stood there, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his posture relaxing. The unspoken connection between them was solid now. It was an invisible wire that ran from the old man's heart to the young man's hands. They understood each other. The gap of generations, of fame, of experience, had been bridged by 3 minutes of dangerous, messy, beautiful music. Julian watched Thorn's face. He saw the older man take a deep breath, filling his lungs, expanding his chest. He saw Thorn's hands uncross. He saw the right hand move slightly, the fingers coming together. The sound that came next was not loud. It was not the roar of a stadium crowd or the crash of thunder. It was the simple, sharp sound of skin meeting skin. Elias Thorn brought his hands together in a single, slow clap. A clap, the sound echoed off the dusty walls of the rehearsal room. It seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the light beams. Julian stood frozen, his eyes wide, staring at the old man. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He wondered for a second if he was imagining it. Maybe the stress had finally made him crazy. Maybe the sound was just a book falling off a table somewhere clapped at a second one, rhythmic, deliberate. Elias Thorn was not smiling a wide, fake smile. He was looking at Julian with a serious, deep expression, nodding his head slightly in time with the clapping. It was the applause of a master craftsman looking at a job well done. It was an applause that said, I see you, I hear you, and you have passed. Clap, clap, clap. The rhythm picked up slightly. It wasn't fast, but it was steady. The sound filled the small room, pushing out the last of the heavy silence, pushing out the fear, pushing out the doubt. The sound seemed to vibrate right against Julian's chest. Julian felt his knees go weak. All the strength he had used to play the piano, all the energy he had poured into the music, was gone. He felt like a balloon that had the air let out of it. He slumped back against the piano, resting his hips against the cold wood. He covered his face with his hands, not to hide his tears this time, but just to touch his own face. To make sure this was real, he was shaking. He couldn't stop it. His shoulders shook up and down. The relief was so strong it hurt. It was like a physical pain in his chest that was finally letting go. He had spent so many months worrying, so many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was good enough, wondering if he was wasting his life. And in this moment, the wondering was over. The clapping continued. Then, a new sound joined in. From the hallway outside the closed door, Julian heard a noise. It was the sound of a door creaking open. Then the shuffling of feet. Then, another pair of hands clapping. Julian peeked through his fingers. The door to the rehearsal room was slowly swinging open. Standing there was a young woman with a violin case strapped to her back. She was one of the students who had been waiting in the hallway. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, looking at Julian with total respect. She was clapping slowly, matching Elias Thorne's rhythm. Then another person appeared behind her. An old man with a broom in his hand, the janitor who cleaned the building. He stopped sweeping and leaned against the doorframe, a toothless grin on his face, clapping his hands together. Then a young man with a cello. Then a woman in a dress. One by one, people who had been listening from the hallway began to appear in the doorway. They didn't say anything. Nobody cheered or shouted, "Bravo." They just watched him and clapped. It was a strange, beautiful sound. The clapping of many hands, all different sizes, all coming together to make one rhythm. The sound grew. It filled the rehearsal room. It spilled out into the hallway. It was a wave of approval. It wasn't just for the notes Julian had played. It was for the risk he had taken. It was for the truth he had told. Every person in that doorway knew how hard it was to be real. They knew the courage it took to stand up in front of a legend and play with your heart instead of your head. Julian stood there, his tears streaming down his face, letting the sound wash over him. He had never heard anything so beautiful in his entire life. Not a symphony, not a choir, nothing. This sound was made for him. It was the sound of acceptance. Elias Thorne stopped clapping first. He lowered his hands slowly, but the sound from the hallway continued for a moment longer, before fading away. The people in the doorway gave him one last nod, one last smile, and then quietly dispersed. Going back to their lives, knowing they had just witnessed something special, the room settled back into silence. But it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the scary silence from the beginning. It was a peaceful silence. The air felt lighter. Thorne walked over to Julian. He stopped right in front of him. He didn't offer his hand to shake. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. His grip was firm and strong. "Do you know what that was?" Thorne asked, his voice low and raspy. Julian tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "That was applause?" he said, feeling stupid. Thorne shook his head. "That was the sound of walls breaking down," he said. "You broke the wall between you and the instrument. You broke the wall between you and me. And when you break a wall like that, people can feel the wind blow through. They want to feel that wind." He squeezed Julian's shoulder. "You have a gift, Julian. But the gift is not that you can play fast. The gift is not that you have strong fingers. Anyone can learn that. The gift is that you have something to say. Most people play music because they want to be famous. They play because they want people to look at them. You played because you had no choice. The music needed to come out." Julian looked down at the floor. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest, melting the last of the ice. "I was so scared," he admitted softly. "I thought you were going to hate it. I thought you were going to laugh at me." "Hate it?" Thorne scoffed gently. "I have heard perfect performances 1,000 times. I forget them by the time I walk out the door. But what you played today, the mess, the anger, the beauty, that I will remember. That is what music is supposed to be. It is supposed to make you feel something." Thorne took his hand off Julian's shoulder and turned back toward his chair to pick up his notebook. He tucked the pen into his pocket. "I can teach you technique," he said, his back to Julian. "I can teach you how to play faster. I can teach you the difficult pieces. But I cannot teach you how to feel. You either have it or you don't. And you have it." Julian watched him. A thought struck him, a terrifying but exciting thought. "Does that mean I passed? Do I get to stay?" Thorne turned around. A small, crooked smile played on his lips. He walked to the door and held it open. "You don't just get to stay," Thorne said. "You get to work. You get to work harder than you have ever worked in your life. I am going to be hard on you. I am going to make you play scales until your fingers fall off. I am going to make you play the same song 50 times in a row. I am going to be terrible to you sometimes." Oh. It was a wet, snuffly laugh, but it was a laugh. "I can handle that," he said. Good, Thorn said. Because I don't have time for students who are looking for an easy ride. But I have plenty of time for a student who is brave enough to play the truth. Julian grabbed his bag and threw it over his shoulder. He looked back at the piano one last time. It looked different now. It didn't look like a monster anymore. It didn't look like an interrogation tool. It looked like a friend. It looked like a place where he could go to be himself. The keys were still a little dusty. The finish was still chipped. But to Julian, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. He walked to the door where Thorn was waiting. As he stepped out into the hallway, the world seemed brighter. The fluorescent lights in the hallway didn't look so harsh anymore. The sounds of the building, the practice rooms buzzing with music, the chatter of students, the footsteps on the stairs didn't sound like noise. It sounded like life. They walked down the long hallway together. The famous musician and the young student, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The lesson was over. The audition was done. As they reached the exit doors that led out to the street, Thorn stopped. He put his hand on the bar to push the door open, but he paused. He looked at Julian sideways. You know, Thorn said quietly, the applause is nice. It feels good. But don't chase it. If you chase the applause, you will stop playing the truth and start playing what they want to hear. And then you will become boring again. I won't, Julian promised. I just want to play like I did today. Every time, Thorn nodded. That is a hard promise to keep. But I think you can do it. He pushed the door open. The bright afternoon sunlight rushed in, blinding them for a moment. The noise of the city cars, sirens, people talking washed over them. It was chaotic and loud, the complete opposite of the quiet rehearsal room. Thorn stepped out onto the sidewalk. He turned to Julian and held out his hand. This time, it was for a handshake. Julian took it. The old man's hand was dry and rough, but it was warm. Practice the scales, Thorn said. And don't be late tomorrow. I won't be, Julian said. Thorn nodded once, then turned and walked away down the busy street. He didn't look like a legend walking away. He just looked like an old man in a gray sweater going to get a coffee or catch a bus. But to Julian, he looked like a giant. Julian stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching him disappear into the crowd. He felt the weight of the piano keys still on his fingertips. He heard the echo of the slow clap in his ears. A young woman walking past bumped into his shoulder by accident. Sorry, she muttered, not looking up, busy texting on her phone. It's okay, Julian said. He smiled at her. She didn't see it, but that didn't matter. He took a deep breath of the city air. It smelled like exhaust fumes and hot pavement, but to him, it smelled like opportunity. He felt lighter than air. He felt like he could float above the buildings.